Hi, I'm Nina Griffin, astrologer and magician. Today I'll be answering some questions I received about astrology and magic from my patrons on patreon.com. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. Your response has been tremendous, and I really appreciate your support, your encouragement, your engagement, your wonderful questions. You guys are so great. Thank you. For those of you who would like to join the Patreon community, you can visit patreon.com/Nina Griffin, and there you will see tiers that allow you to receive different benefits depending on the contribution. You can go anywhere from early access to videos, to access to exclusive videos, and up to participation in a monthly Q&A with me. However, regardless of your level, if you're a patron, I love getting your questions, and as you can see, my goal is to incorporate them into frequent videos where I answer some of your questions and, well, burning queries. All right, let's get started. My first question that I'll answer is from Caroline, and her question is perhaps the most philosophical and deepest that I will be answering today. Caroline wanted to understand, what is the magico-astrological conception of the planets as entities? Well, Caroline, the answer is not simple. However, your question is also not new, which is great because it means that it's been answered before. Probably the most thorough and deeply philosophical answer to this question lies in a very old book by a philosopher called Iamblichus, who was a Neoplatonist philosopher very much concerned with the intersection of astrology and magic. And he wrote some truly profound and inspiring material about this subject. I have a book here to show you. It's a beautiful edition. This is the Iamblichus on Mysteries combined with his Life of Pythagoras. And this is volume 18 in the Thomas Taylor translations. So Thomas Taylor was an 18th century Englishman who was really gifted in languages, but he was also I would say a Neoplatonist. In his time, he was called the English pagan, which was obviously partly complimentary, partly not, because of his deep understanding and sympathy with the material that he translated from Plato and from the Neoplatonist philosophers. Iamblichus explains that the cosmos is really under the rule of the one, or the monad. This is really a Pythagorean concept that later made its way into Platonism and Neoplatonism, or as it's now preferred to be called, late Platonism. Still, it's the same thing. And the monad is something like the one god of the Abrahamic religions. The difference, at least as I understand it, is that the monad is not really a personal god the way that we might see it in Christianity or Judaism or Islam. You know, it doesn't really lend itself to a portrayal of old man with beard wearing sandals. Rather, the monad is a little bit more like the Tao in the Eastern concept. It's really the all, it's the way, it's simply the way that things are. Now, it's much more abstract. From the monad proceed the different gods of antiquity. Now, of course, the ones that Iamblichus and others were most familiar with were the Greek or Hellenistic gods who were very popular and lived in different incarnations around the Mediterranean of Iamblichus's time. But really, this would apply to any divinity, whether in Hinduism or in other cultures. There's really no difference from Iamblichus's perspective. These divinities they're very much elevated. They're already a distinction from the monad, so they're not as perfect as the one, because this is where the monad starts to take on different characteristics. You have the goddess of love and the god of war and the god of agriculture over here. So they start to specialize, and in specializing, they move one step further from the monad. You can kind of think of them as children of the one, for lack of a better term. So the planets, then, are not the gods. I don't think that Iamblichus would have said that. The planets, rather, are physical manifestations or vehicles or signs of these divinities. If you're familiar with the concept of the Great Chain of Being, this is something that I teach in my Astrological Magic course that I'll be teaching in this fall, and I taught last year at Kepler College. The idea is that the Great Chain of Being starts at the very top with a monad. Then the next link further down is the god, let's say Aphrodite or Venus, the goddess of love. And then below that might be Aphrodite's, what we today might call an archangel, right? The most elevated spiritual being that is not quite the deity, but it's just one step below, still very potent, still very powerful. And so below that, then you get descending powers of angels and sub-angels, intelligences and spirits, until somewhere at the very bottom you get down to earth, and then you start looking at things like animals associated with Venus and birds, and then minerals probably at the very bottom because they are inert. So the way to really think about the planets is that they are quite high up on this great chain of being. They are not higher than the gods, and they are not the gods themselves, but they are somewhere on the chain because as they move, so do the gods move. Although Iamblichus and others would have said that really, ultimately, it's the mind of the monad that makes the gods move and therefore the planets as well. I hope that answered your question. I'm also showing a picture of the book so that if you're interested in reading more about this, you know where to go for kind of the real deal, the original source, Iamblichus. All right, my second question is from Monique. Now we're down to exactly the opposite end of the great chain of being. We go from these very lofty topics to the concept of how do I make my own stone or metal talisman? Now, I should mention I am in no way a metalsmith or a jeweler, very clearly not. The good news is that the quality or the beauty of your work does not impact the efficacy of your talisman. But there are some practical things that you will have to learn if you want to make your own talismans on materials other than paper. The first thing that you will want to obtain, if you don't already have it, is of course material for your talisman. You will need to get whatever metal you're working with, or whatever stone or mineral that you might be working with. I always recommend getting an inexpensive version of the stone so that you can get a larger piece where you have the room to engrave the planetary seal or whatever else that you need to engrave on it. Now, you have a few options. You can get a handheld, a diamond-tipped engraving tool, literally just like a manual pen, but it's got a diamond tip on it. Now, this isn't easy, but it's probably the easiest thing to do if you are engraving a relatively soft and not too difficult to engrave material. If you're engraving harder material, and maybe you don't need quite as much precision, but you want the engraving to be very clear and strong, this is when you will need to get one of these. This is a Dremel engraver, and you can get it pretty inexpensively, at least in the United States, on places like Amazon. Now, you will notice that the engraver here does not have a tip. It comes with a tip, but it's not particularly strong. It's kind of a very generic one that's not, it's probably not going to engrave metal or certain stones very well. So what I recommend is you get a separate engraving kit, which has all these different tool tips. And the ones that you'll probably use the most are the diamond-tipped ends, because they will pretty much engrave anything you need. One thing I recommend for sure is that before you do your first ritual where you're making your talisman with an engraver, whether it's the electric engraver or the handheld one, you will definitely want to practice. Engraving nicely is hard, and so, it's one of those things where just engraving a circle is going to feel like an accomplishment. At least it did for me. So what I would suggest is, get a few different pieces of material and practice with them before the electional moment. You don't want to be frustrated, and you want to have a general sense of how long it might take you to make the talisman. So that's my practical answer. I hope it's useful. The other option, of course, is if you have a talisman you absolutely want to make and you want it to be beautiful, you might work with a jeweler or a metalsmith who is able to do it at the appointed time. This is something that I recommend, and I've done that myself. So for those items that are more, high quality and maybe jewelry quality, you might work with a professional who can really make it look good and still make it at the appointed electional time. All right, so the third question is how can I protect myself and my home against theft? So this question came from Sasha, and she has been getting she said, some pretty negative tarot readings. And she's been concerned that this might mean that she could be a victim of theft. So luckily, astrology, and I would say astrological magic particularly, has you covered, Sasha. And I love this topic because these are talismans that we all can easily make, and we probably all should do. You know, nobody is immune against theft, whether it's petty theft or whether it's a more serious burglary or other crime like that. So you have a few options, Sasha. One is, and this is something that of course you'd have to wait for, is to make a nice Saturn talisman. So why Saturn? The reason that I like Saturn is that he is the planet of boundaries, of limits, and of walls. He is the planet of no. So in other words, if you're trying to keep burglars away from your home, or like a purse snatcher away from your bag on the street, Saturn is the thing that puts up a hand and just says, stand back. So the challenge here, of course, is that it takes a while for Saturn to get to a good place. And unfortunately, even though he is in his domicile all of 2020, he's not going to be very good for talismans a lot of this year because of the hard aspect to Mars that he's going to be making. What I would suggest is waiting until 2021 to make your Saturn talisman. I will talk about this in my monthly magical elections, so when the time comes, you will know, okay, now is the moment. However, you might want a talisman sooner than that. What I recommend for kind of your more normal run-of-the-mill anti-theft talisman is the talisman of the 17th lunar mansion. So this lunar mansion is between 25 Libra and 8 Scorpio. So you would make this talisman when the moon is in that zodiacal range. And of course, the moon has to be on the ascendant or on the midheaven. You also want the moon applying to a planet that is favorable and protective. Personally, I would be happy with a soft aspect to Saturn, because again, Saturn is a nice kind of protective planet in this case. You could also do a harmonious aspect to one of the benefic planets, particularly Jupiter, but Venus could probably work as well. In other words, any planet that has a reputation for being protective, so Jupiter or even Venus, those would all be good options for the moon's next applying aspect. All right. Now, the thing is that for this talisman, you are supposed to engrave the image of a monkey in an iron seal. Iron isn't too difficult to get. I think you could use probably like a piece of stainless steel or something like that. And the image has to be monkey with its hands above its shoulders. It's not really said in what posture, but you can be a little bit creative there. Now, according to the Picatrix, which is where this recipe comes from, you're then supposed to suffumigate or pass this talisman through the incense of the fur of a monkey and the fur of a female mouse. I don't recommend that for animal cruelty issues. However, you can definitely use a talismanic incense that's appropriate for this particular concept. So I don't recommend any kind of animal hair, but I would recommend something like a Saturn incense. Whatever planet you've decided to focus on here, whatever the moon's next aspect will be, that would be an appropriate planet whose incense you could use here instead of the animal hair. So just a recommendation. All right, Sasha, I hope this helps, and I hope that this helps give you a little bit of peace and something constructive to do to hopefully prevent theft and crime. All right, everyone, I think this is it. If you have more questions and you're a patron, please let me know. I would love to answer them in a future video. Don't be shy. If I know the answer, and sometimes even if I don't, I might give you an answer on the next episode. All right, thanks everyone.